Good day everyone, I am Roco now, the second presenter from the group 5. Our topic is all about the ANTHOPHYTA or the flowering plants, but my assigned topic is all about the life cycle of an endemic flowering plants. But before we start, I have these objectives. So at the end of the lesson, students in the following describe the steps involved in the life cycle of plants, differentiate between the male and the female parts of the flower, identify the flowering stages of the flowering life cycle of the flower, cell, pollination, and the fruit, outline pollen grain development from microscope mother cells, and describe the process of fertilization. So let's start of the flower. It is the reproductive unit of angiosperms. So flower it have two reproductive organs, which is the female and the male. So in the female reproductive organs it has a pistil. It is the collective terms for the carpels. So each carpels includes an ovary where the ovules are produced. Ovules are the female reproductive cells and the eggs. It have a style, a tube on the top of the ovary, and a stigma, which receive the pollen during fertilization. So in the male reproductive organs, it have stamens that the parts of the flowers. So stamen consists of an anther, which produce pollen, and a filament. So as you can see, we have this flower. So it have sepals. So this recovering the flower when it was just a bud and protecting in the growing bud. So we look at the flower. We see down here we have the sepals. This is where covering the flower when it was just a bud, protecting in the growing bud. So we have these petals. So we will talk about the function of the petals later. So also we have this anther, the filament, which together makes the stamen. So this is make structures of the flower. It's where pollen produced in the middle, and we have this base like structure at the top, of which is called the stigma, the long thin neck called the style, and we have in the bottom the swollen parts, it is the ovary. So we have these parts of the flower. Flower stalk, pedicel gives support to the flower and elevates the flower for the insects. Receptacle, this is the flower's attachment to the stalk and in some cases becomes part of the fruit after fertilization. We have the example is the strawberry. So in the petal to attract, so petal can attract the insects into the flower. Sepals protect the flower while the flower is developing from a bud. And the nectary, where a sugary solution called nectar is held to attract insects. Next, we have this in the parts of a function. So together these three parts make up the carpel, and this is the female part of the flower. So ito po siya. And this is a male parts of the flower. So the pollen production. So some flowers might only have the female structures and other flowers only the male structures. But to simplify, have just kind of done a generic flowers here. So next we have the pollen development. So when we see in the male size, first with pollen development in the stamen, and then we see the anther, the stamen and the anther, then we can see the diploid cells. So remember, when we look at the flowering plants, we see the sporophyte generation or the diploid generation. So before a flowering plant can reproduce, pollination must occur. So pollination occurs when pollen from the male structure or anther is transferred to the female structure or stigma. So these cells inside the anther are called microspore mother cells, or the mother cells for two spores. So to become a haploid spore, it will undergo meiosis, and inside the anther, it builds microspore. So, mauni siya. So, when we say spores, it become the gametophyte generation. It grow by mitosis to form pollen grains. So, remember that the pollen grain is the male gametophyte and in flowering of the flowering plants and seed plants. So, an anther consists of 4 chambers called pollen sacs. So we have this the male gametophyte or pollen. So inside the pollen, there are two distinct cells: the tube cells and generative cells. The tube cells, the tube cells and generative. So in the whole process of pollen development inside the anther, the microspore mother cells undergoing meiosis, so to make the haploid microspores. The microspores developing the pollen grain. So the tube cells will make tube styles to the ovary, to aid fertilization. And the generative nucleus will generate the sperm cells. So this is the gametophyte. This is not a male gamete, or pollen is not a tree. So sperm, it is the gametophyte, but it will be transferred from one plant to another. So let's proceed to the egg development. So inside the ovary are ovules. So if we could look inside the ovary, we could see many structures, sometimes more than one, sometimes just one. These structures are egg producing structures. They're called ovules. So the sporophyte, it is the megaspore mother cells. So it going to give rise to the megaspore, and this diploid cell undergoes the meiosis, forming haploid megaspore. So the megaspore mother cell, so as we can see here in the image, the megaspore mother cell undergoes meiosis to make megaspores. Typically, the only one megaspore survives, the others disintegrate. So most of the time, all the megaspore except for the disintegrates, only one megaspore survives. There's one megaspore. So the spore that will become the gametophyte. So here in the image, so as you can see, it divides and it goes through 3 rounds of mitotic division. So have the 3 nuclear divisions. So ito, So one nuclear becomes 2, and the 2 becomes 4, and 4 becomes 8. So these 8 nuclei are divided into themselves through cytokinesis, but only 7 cells form. 7 lang siya. Then this female gametophyte, that's the egg of this haploid nuclei, will be the egg. So this 2 special cell that has 2 haploid nuclei, and it is the endosperm mother cell. It will give rise to the sperm. It's an N plus N cell. So before sila ma one cell develops, daghan na ay siya process. So these other 5 haploid cells becomes the synergids, which they're unimportant cells. So they're going to disintegrate. So katong wala mabilong sa 7 what I've said ati kanina na 7 cells form lang ang ma-form. So here's the whole side of the female reproductive structures of egg development. So the megaspore, the mother cell, becomes the megaspore. So one of them survive and divide to make this structure inside the ovule. Prepared inside the ovule that prepared for the sperm. We have the pollen made in the anther, and the eggs are already inside the ovule. So next we need pollination. A pollination, it is a transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So to get the pollen from an anther to a stigma, it will wind of pollen. So the wind borne and even the water, so can move pollen. But when we think about a flower, an angiosperm, the things that unique. So unique siya sa kanang ma-difference siya between the angiosperm and the gymnosperm. So we have this self-pollination. Self-pollination, it involves the transfer of pollen within the same plant. The stigma receive pollen grains from the same flower, or the stigma receive pollen grains from the same plant. So mao ni siya ang self-pollination. So the cross-pollination involves the transfer of pollen between different plants. Stigma receive pollen from another plants. So mao ni siya. What is the evolutionary significance of petals, nectar, that fragrance of the flower? So some says they attract the pollinators. So insect pollination use brightly colored petals or have sweet scents to attract insects. So pollen grains are rough and sticky to cling into the insect's body. So we have the wind pollination. Anthers hang outside the flower so that the wind will blow the pollen grains into the air. The styles and feathery stigma also hang outside the flower to trap pollen grains carried by the wind. And the pollen grains are smooth and light, easily carried by the wind. So how important pollinators are to the angiosperm? So the biotic vectors, it is a petty way of saying pollinators, living things that move pollen from one. Importance of pollinators to angiosperm. In fact, there been a coevolution, flowers and animals, to ensure or aid this process of the plant, providing some nutritional value to the animals, and the animals in turn moving the pollen from one flower to another to aid in reproduction. Next, we have the fertilization. It, this is the carpel, and here is the pollen on. So on the top of the tube cell, so it have the generative cells, so the process of fertilization. In the fertilization, the tube grows down towards the ovary to an ovule. A sperm produced by the pollen grain then travels through the pollen tube in the ovule. A sperm fertilizes an egg in the ovule, so the ovary enlarges and becomes a fruit, and the ovule develops into a seed. So we have the tube cell. It creates a tube down through the style to the ovule then. So as you can see in the here in the image, naa diri ang tube cell. So sila ang nag-create down to the pasingod sa ovule. Also we have the generative. Ang generative cell is going to generate two sperm cells that travels down to the tube. Hindi sila mag-travel. So one of the sperm is going to fuse the egg to make the zygote. The second sperm is going to fuse with the endosperm mother cell to make the triploid endosperm, that to be the beginning of endosperm and to nutritive tissue. So mauni sila no, na matawag din sila na a double fertilization since there are two fusion, no? This is the difference between the gymnosperm and the angiosperm. Gymnosperm don't have this, the nutritive tissue, the endosperm. It's a haploid but an angiosperm because of this unique plus N cell. So the nutritious diploid, and it's fertilized by one of the sperm, the double fertilization. So inside the ovule start, we have the zygote, kani, and the growing endosperm under structure going to divide. So ma-divide gid sila. Next, we have the embryo and the cell development. So now these are the angiosperms of that introduced seed plants that define what angiosperms, and that means covered the seed. So the fertilized matured ovule of a flowering plants containing an embryo or rudimentary plants. So the zygote in the ovule starts dividing by the mitosis. The embryo has lobes of meristematic tissue that give rise to cotyledon or the embryonic leaves. So by the time the embryo matures, the ovules becomes detached from the walls of the ovary. So its integuments or the outer covering taken and hardened into a seed coat. So the embryo food reserves or the endosperm that nutritive tissue surrounding it, and said could constitute the seed. Next, we have the fruit development. So let's see how the fruit develops. So the ovary of the flower is going to start to swell, and the petals of the flower start to break down and start to fall away. So makita niyo sa image na nagka-change siya. So the ovary will continue to grow and the ovary becomes the fruit. So the ovules are inside of the ovaries of the ovary seed are inside of fruit, and the ovules becomes a seed and the ovary becomes the fruit. So sometimes other parts of the flower are incorporated into the fruit. Sometimes are fleshy and some are dry like acorn and the pea pods. So some question what the function of fruit. So the function of fruits, it is protect the seed. But if we think the fruits, What's protective of a seed if the fruits encourage to eat it? So anything with a seed inside of it, it is a fruit. So for example, the pea pods. So pea pods is the pod itself. So the fruits and the peas are the seeds. So the peanuts, this is a fruit, and inside are the seeds. So and we have a seeds like all the nuts are better source for fruits. So the function of fruits, it is to aid in a seed dispersal, to be caught by the wind or to float in the water or to even be eaten by an animal, go through the digestive tract to protect it against the harsh enzymes and acids in its own little pile of fertilizer. It's the agency dispersal which helps the plant survive. So the seeds have an advantage of allowing us to move into a broader range of environment, but the flowers and fruits have evolved to aid in of reproduction of plants and to spread the seed. Next, we have the parts of the fruit. The fruit is the part of a plant which is in charge of protecting the seeds and guarantee their dispersal. So it becomes as a result of fertilization inside the carpel, which produce the repairing of the ovary walls that will create the fruit. So some fruits, however, have another origin deriving from the flower receptacle or some other parts of the flower. So we have also the parts of the fruit, the pericarp, exocarp, mesocarp, and endocarp. So the pericarp, it is the external part of a fruit. It is all that surrounds the seed. It is divided into the exocarp, mesocarp, and endocarp. So the exocarp is the outer covering in an apple. For instance, for example, the apple. So for an instance, it is what we know as the skin. While the mesocarp, it is the middle covering in a peach, what we ordinarily call the flesh. And the endocarp, it is the inner covering. So in many cases, the stiffened part normally covering the seeds. In a coconut, for example, what we commonly known as the stone. Also, we have this part, the radicle. It is the part of the embryo which emerges first. So once outside, it develops into a main root, producing root hairs and secondary roots. So plumule, it's like a leaf in its early development. So hypocotyl is the space between the radicle and the plumule. So it develops into a stem. Endosperm, it is the food supply content in the seed. So this is sometimes included in the cotyledons, which either achieves the function of primary leaves or food storage, even both of them in some cases. So cotyledon, it is an embryonic leaf and seed-bearing plants for food storage. Seeds coat or testa, it is the outer layer of the seed. And the micropyle is a little pore on the seed coat through which part from entering the sperm. So the seed absorbs water to begin germination. We have the types of growth in plants which is the primary growth and the secondary growth. So the primary growth, it is the upward growth of stem and downward growth of the roots, so increases the length. While the secondary growth, it is the result of the activity of the two lateral meristems, the cork cambium and the vascular cambium, arise from lateral meristems and increases the girth of the plant root or stem rather than its length. So what controls flowering? The length of the night. During the day, plants take in light, water, and nutrients needed to go through the photosynthesis. Then at night, it uses the glucose or the food to grow and reproduce. So this is how the flowering plant life cycle. So that's all I have to share, and I hope you will understand about my topics. Thank you.